Right, hello, folks. We're back. This is episode five. Five already there. Episode 5 of Talk ADHD. Good grief! And as you could tell, this will be going out very near that day. That's why there's two of us in Christmas jumpers because you got to theme this. So
Didn't get the memo.
no, I know. I'll let you off last minute. So here we go then. Episode 5. And again, it's one of the first topics we've been asked to cover, and it's also one of probably the most difficult, biggest, and probably one that we're going to have to go back to because we are talking all things, or maybe not all things, but we're talking addiction. We're talking addiction and its links to ADHD and other. Why are so many people with ADHD and potentially autism at risk of developing addictions? How do we spot it? What are the signs? What is an addiction anyway? I think is going to be important, isn't it? And what can we do to try and help? Before we start, though, and I want to make this really clear because again, the community have asked some brilliant questions about addiction and what it means to them. What this podcast can't be, this one or any other one, as we talk about addiction, is sort of a recovery exercise. We can't tell anyone what recovery should or shouldn't look like for them, or how to go about that. That's a very different topic. But I think in this podcast, what is important to do is to really properly, openly, and honestly talk about the fact that this is an issue for a lot of people. This does cause problems in relationships of all kinds, work, family, etc. And also to try and broaden what we mean when we say addiction. And we'll probably explain that in a moment. So I'm joined by my two favourite experts again. I've got Sarah J and Andrew J. And they can bring, again, this ADHD clinical knowledge. Sarah has a massive experience having worked in and around addiction as well, and I'll let you tell everyone about that in a minute if that's okay. And for my part, and I've said it before, but I'm going to say it again, I am sat here in front of you all as an addict in recovery. I have no shame in saying that. In fact, it fills me with great pride to be able to say I'm in recovery. 10 months this Tuesday, 10 months 2 weeks ago, in fact. So, I'm coming up for 11 months. I'm very proud of that. So I can talk about this from a very personal point of view of how did it interplay with my ADHD and autism, and why I wasn't able to admit it for so long, and what's happened since. But I think it's important to start with the basics. But before we do, Sarah, do you want to give people an overview of what have you done in and around this topic, and what did it teach you about the links between what you learned about addiction and ADHD?
Right. So my background before I came into the world of ADHD was working in criminal justice field. So working in what would be classed as forensics. I worked in the prisons as care coordinator. So people in the long-term prison state, working as a mental health nurse, as well as what would be classed as it's now a local community Cat B prison. So people who would be remanded quite quickly from court for lots of different difficulties. Worked in the mental health team, so we'll get called down to see people. Worked hand in hand with the addiction services that were working in the prisons. Also spent a lot of time working as a criminal justice nurse, working in police stations, courts, probations, and again, working hand in hand with people who were on DRRs, who was drug rehabilitation orders, working with people as a mental health nurse, looking at their difficulties if they were on alcohol treatment requirements. Always weaved in and out of everything you've done in mental health because it goes hand in hand. Then worked with some prolific offenders and worked around substance use, and was having this conversation with Andrew earlier on. And one of the people, so I did a research project, and one of the clients in that research project had ADHD. And it was that identification of them. Totally forgot I did this. Identification and then getting them into mental health services, local mental health services for that ADHD assessment, and then diagnosis and treatment. It was an adult. And then was working in the world of ADHD, and just before I left the NHS, I took a role as a clinical lead working in a complex needs team. So working with people who were at risk of homelessness or were homeless, working with the hostels. There was 2 social workers from the local council and 2 nurses. I was the mental health nurse. The other nurse, if you cut through the middle, like a stick of rock, you'd have substance misuse. Done it for years and years, knew his stuff. And what was evident in the time I spent doing that for a good couple of years was that neurodevelopmental difficulties played a huge part. So I think we talked about the last time, step care model. You start with all mental health or primary care, you start at sort of level 1, 2, and 3. And I remember having people, other workers in level 1, coming to me going, I've been told that you have a lot of knowledge about neurodevelopmental difficulties, ADHD, autism. Can I just ask you, I've got Billy Bloggs has come in and Billy is using lots of cocaine, but they're not using it to party. They are using cocaine to be able to focus at work, to be able to come home and do the DIY they need to do at
Mm.
home. But it is really expensive. And they are really struggling with the fact that they are using cocaine to be able to function and deal with their life. What do I do? And my first words out my mouth were, do an ASRS. So do a screening tool and see what they're coming back with. This isn't just a little bit to party. And that was really common. So meeting people who were within addiction services or in the homeless hostels. I remember having a client where we supported the homeless hostel with somebody who was waiting for an autism assessment, and I would quite happily put money on the fact that they got that positive diagnosis, and working with the hostel staff to support that person with their presentation and their needs around autism. And it wasn't a one-off. It was really common. So we did training sessions. But yet again, as we've talked a lot, nurses did not initially have a lot of training on neurodevelopmental disorders. You go out to the community, and the community mental health teams, the addiction services, the frontline staff working in A&E, working within police stations. There's an awareness. They might do an hour online training on neurodiversity. I'm working with clients who come through police stations or courts. That's it. So that's where
Yeah.
my background and my contact with people who have a dual diagnosis, as it's called in the literature, coexisting conditions but dual diagnosis. It's been part of my career all the way through.
Fantastic. Which means your history, your information, and you spoke about this when we first were on the podcast about this, what you probably knew then and what you know now and what you understood then and what you understand now, it just changes and changes. And then Andrew and I have spoken again at length about this. So let's come to you, Andrew. It sounds like a really obvious statement when we have a condition, a neurodevelopmental condition that has impulsivity and hyperactive thought and poor decision making at its core. It seems like a really obvious statement to say there might be some risk that we may be finding ourselves indulging in things or doing things that we shouldn't, or doing them too much. But let's do a very brief. So what is the science then? What's making that the case? Oh, hold on, can't hear you. Stop, Andrew. You've gone. Is that just me?
Oh no, it's me.
There you go. That'll do it.
Oh,
right. So go on in. I know I've asked you one of those questions.
Yeah. So it's another one of those multi-layered questions, and I'd like to, as I usually do, boil it down to basics.
Yeah, go for it.
And contradict things I've said before. just for fun.
Why not?
And I'm going to talk principally about substances.
Yeah, sure.
But that does extend out. Yeah. So the majority of illicit substances that people abuse are dopaminergic.
Right.
Yeah. So most substances, so Sarah's just been talking about cocaine in her worked example, but you will see an increase in synaptic dopamine with cannabis. Certainly amphetamine, that's what's we're prescribing that as a treatment for ADHD. But you see it in other substances as well. So there's something biological there going on that starts something. And for those of us with ADHD, I'd like you to go back and think about starting secondary school. So you've left primary school, you've left the running around the playground with your coat over your head, catching the wind and being noisy, and all of those things that it's okay when you're in primary school to do. Yeah. Then you go into secondary school, and with ADHD, probably not diagnosed, you hit this wall of challenge, this wall of demands on attention, organization, executive functioning.
Right.
And I think most of us can sort of, certainly pretty much everyone I've ever diagnosed, when I ask them to think about this time in their life, can talk about the experience of being in what's now called year 7.
Yeah.
That culture shock of going into secondary school. And at around that time, we talked about this a couple of episodes ago, we're seeing puberty coming. We're seeing an awareness of ourselves, a social awareness starting to happen. And we start to notice that we're different. We start to notice that there are things that make us stand out. And we don't want people to see those. So we try and hide it. And for me, that usually is the root of the more common than not anxiety disorder that underpins our ADHD. That's where it comes from. We're starting to question ourselves. And those few years, that early puberty through to GCSE years, we're really wrangling with who we are, where we fit in, and all of that. And a lot of us have memories of not feeling like we do. Yeah. With this uncomfortable knot in our solar plexus. Something doesn't feel right. We don't know what it is, but we don't seem to work like everybody else works. And at that point, you face a number of choices. You can go in any number of directions, and people do. I've heard thousands of stories, and those stories are all different, but there are some common themes, and certainly one where there's substance misuse is the discovery that there are substances that make you feel different, think differently, think more like how you see other people thinking.
Yeah.
And that can start a journey in a very different direction. But one of the things it can do is I finally found something that makes me feel better. So I'm going to do that more. Because that's what we do. If something makes you feel good, you're going to do it more because it takes away that feeling of, I'm not right, but this makes me feel right. And there are all sorts of social implications of that, but the personal implications of that is you move further and further away from this sense of difference.
Right.
So for me, I think there is substance misuse and substance use can be the beginning of finding something that at last makes sense, where nothing has so far, where everywhere I've turned, every teacher I've gone to and said I feel different, and every time I've said, but I can't concentrate on this, and I've been pushed away, finally something dials up my focus and concentration a bit. I can finally think through all the noise. The video you played last week, that sort of, I can finally just switch that off. I talked about that after the video last time that neurotypicals probably did just switch off with that, and we ADHDers can't. But we find a substance or an activity that helps with that. Of course, we're going to do it more.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? And it's interesting.
I'm not sure we're down the road of addiction yet, but for me, that's the start of many people's stories that take them to addiction.
Yeah, no, I think that's an incredibly important point. That's not addiction. You're right. But I think what we get addicted to, because let's be fair, most people will refer to that as self-medication in some way or another, won't they? You know, it's that numbing of the world. It's that feeling like I fit in, and that sort of self-medicating all of the pain and the discomfort away, right? I completely get that. But you're right. I think we're not there at addiction at that point. It's when doing that, taking that, whatever that is, and we'll come on to everything other than substance, I think, as well. But it's when that thing becomes obsession. It becomes something you tell yourself you cannot function in any way. Not just those few circumstances or few situations. You can't function at all unless I've had weed or coke or whatever else it may be, the thing you've done. That's the thing when we're down the line of addiction. I was just listening to that and thinking, okay, this is probably a good point to define this, right? Dictionary definition, broadly speaking, of addiction is an inability to stop doing or using something, especially if something is harmful. Okay, that's a fairly straightforward description, right? My definition of it is slightly further than that, and I've just mentioned this. It's when it goes from something I like to being something that I can't stop thinking about, to something that I can't stop doing, to something that I literally have to do, even if I know it's detrimental to a host of things, including myself and those around me, something I have to do at the expense of things I know I should do instead. And this is where it then becomes a thing that can affect, if it's young enough, school life or college or uni or work or relationships, because now the reality stops. And this is a part of the conversation I think that's interesting, and I wanted to ask you is, in my journey of understanding my own addictions, of which there've been substance and behavioural, so mostly cigarettes and alcohol when I was sort of early 20s, and then behavioural. As I look back on it now, being where I am, the bit I don't think I was aware of, the bit I could never see coming, was what's often defined as the madness. There are times where I would be doing things, and there's a little bit of my brain, a little bit of our brains that goes, I know I shouldn't do it. You remember the old Tom and Jerry cartoons of the 80s with the angel and the devil on the shoulder, right? It's that analogy,
Yeah.
right? And you've got the angel going, no, we shouldn't do this. You should be working on the project or going to work. And the devil going, just do it. It's when that voice literally becomes so loud, nothing else matters. But without fail, and I've never met an addict in recovery who hasn't said this, without fail, every time we've then done it, in an instant, there's the guilt and the shame and the, oh, what have I done? Even though we know that we've been driven by this motor, and even though ADHD might have been, or inevitably has been part of that. And I wonder if that's because we've spoken about dopamine, and you mentioned that a lot of these are dopaminergic. Is that some way faulty wiring is the only word that comes to my head in terms of how our brains are utilizing or perceiving that rush of dopamine? I've often described it as it's an unhealthy dopamine seeking, but it feels better than healthy. You know, I know I could feel good if I go for a walk, but this makes me feel completely different, so I'll do that instead. Does that make any sense to either of you?
You're waiting for me to speak, Sarah.
Either or in your experience, because I don't know whether that makes sense.
All sorts going through my head because,
Me too.
yeah, with any addiction, it isn't straightforward, isn't linear.
No.
It happens for a myriad of reasons. So whether it is the fact you have an untreated disorder and you're looking for that dopamine, whether it is trauma,
Yeah.
it's a trigger from the past, whether there are other coexisting conditions
Yeah.
alongside. You know, is there depression going on? Is there anxiety going on? It's never, ever straightforward, ever.
No.
And
No.
it's really hard to pick it apart until you are one-on-one with somebody. You know, all of recovery, like all of health and mental health, you know, you have to have that when the decision comes to change, because that's what it is,
Mm.
you're making a decision to change something. When that decision comes, the assessment at that point is useful in terms of helping you to understand what's going on and what is driving the feelings and the thoughts you're having for whatever reason. Then there's change again isn't linear. So
No.
you don't just make a decision and you change.
Oh,
There is
no.
going to be relapse.
Yeah.
Yeah, and relapse will happen for all sorts of reasons. But relapse is a useful thing because it helps you understand what's driven to that point, what happened,
Yeah.
what were those triggers. You know, relapse is never failure.
No.
It's about learning more and about moving on.
Are we
Your
more at
brain will
risk
tell
of...
you and will guilt you.
Well,
Yeah,
yeah. So here's a question. Are
yeah.
we more at risk as ADHDers of relapsing?
According to some of the research literature, yes. So there is a fantastic consensus statement out there written by Susan Young and her colleagues, some of the big names in the world of ADHD. So Samuel Cortez, Joe Johnson does lots of sessions, Peter Mason, David Nutt, and they look at substance use disorder.
Mm.
This is more about substances because we know that in the world of addictions, there is more than just substances.
Right. Yeah. Well,
And they talk about how somebody with ADHD or undiagnosed ADHD, you know, where the stats will show you that you are more likely to present with a substance use disorder and ADHD than the general population. So there's something that I was reading earlier on, and it was a quote quoting an article, and it was dated 2010, and the stats were 58% of the population had a coexisting substance use disorder. Now this was 2010. I wouldn't like to say that's still the same, but you know, that's more than half. More than half of the people that were in this study had a substance use
wow.
difficulty with ADHD. So that's quite a lot.
Wow. Yeah. That's not insignificant.
Yeah. No.
Blimey.
But it's not
And
It's not surprising because until we come across these four letters and what they mean and find our tribe, as people say, we are that teenager finding things that work for
Yeah.
us.
Yeah.
And what's coming across, what I'm hearing in this conversation, is that there's something about a discomfort that doing something makes go away, and that drives this.
Yeah. Yeah, it does. It does. I think you're absolutely right. And it's I think that phrase that Sarah's just used is really important in this conversation. Well, addiction itself isn't linear. And some of the research I've been doing points to the fact that rarely, if ever, is somebody who's predisposed to addiction going to only struggle with one addiction in their lifetime. It's more common that we struggle with one thing and then another. And you know, blimey, I don't know anyone in recovery that hasn't struggled with more than one. But I was reading some information, and we've spoken about addiction isn't just substance use. So bringing it right up to current times, I was trying to research what's the thing that most young people are at risk of developing first as an addiction now. Because I think if we'd gone back 20 years, maybe 30 years, let's say, pre-internet, we'd probably have been still down the road of tobacco or alcohol and then maybe other substances. I don't think it takes any great jump to guess what the answer is now, which is anything connected to the use of a screen or an internet connected device. What's scarier is how young kids are at risk of showing signs of addiction. You know, now we can all make jokes and we can all sort of accuse parents and roll our eyes at parents when we see, you know, toddlers out in pushchairs with a tablet and things. Oh, you know, digital nanny and things. That's okay. I see that. The issue is the research all points to the fact that we now have kids developing the patterns of addiction, dependency, and this compulsion at a much younger age. And what's worse is the availability of the content, right? It's scary. I think, you know, we're talking offline, some of the research, it says how often and how young children are when they're seeing pornography for the first time now is frankly horrific. But if you take all of those children that may be exposed to pornography at a young age, it's abhorrent. That's a fact. If you then assume that out of those children, the ones with ADHD may have that predisposition to then seek that feeling that they get from seeing that, they're at risk of developing a really unhealthy addiction to content online at a really young age. And yet we reach the sort of age you were talking about, Andrew, secondary school, maybe towards the end, where we get a bit more exposure then, even now, to things like drugs or alcohol or whatever it may be. And it's amazing how many people put down that digital addiction for a while, hyper focus, let's call it that, on something new. I've discovered booze, I've discovered weed, or whatever it may be. End up as an adult going, I have a problem. Pick that, go, I am in recovery, I've recovered from that, and then pick up the addiction that was with them first. We've seen it for years with pornography, and we're going to see it earlier and more, I honestly believe, now with screen addiction starting so young. And if we are predisposed to this, this is about, and I'll come to you on this, Sarah, because you do the education piece, and you spoke about the sort of kids and prison service and things, right? This is about early education, really early education for parents and schools and educators to say, we have to be very, very careful now. We are going to see kids getting into an awful lot of trouble if we're not careful. And is there anything we can do to avoid that? I suppose is where my head constantly goes. I think about this every day, but I don't know what the answer is apart from education.
We're looking purely at ADHD, then yeah, education, identification, the earliest opportunity in treatment. But not just education of people who may be able to pick up the symptoms, but education of the young person.
Yeah.
Explain to the young person what that diagnosis means, what that feeling they have. We know, and this isn't just ADHD. Sort of speaking with different parents around where we live at different support places that I've gone to in different parents. One of the things that was quite disturbing, I think, was about this time last year. We were talking about the impact of lockdown and the impact of lockdown on sex education or the lack of it.
Yeah.
And there was some concerning situations happening. I'm not going to go into the details because it blew my mind. But I remember one of the quotes is that there are young girls out there who believe, and we're talking people who are sort of in year 9 and year 10, so 13, 14, who believe because of porn that if their boyfriend does not strangle them during sex, that they are not loved.
Yeah, I know, I've seen the same. Yeah. It's shocking, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's shocking.
And then, you know, if we've got vulnerable kids with neurodevelopmental difficulties and the world and their peers who may or may not have the same difficulties are telling them this is what a healthy relationship is, then that becomes tricky as well.
It does.
It has to be about education.
It does.
Yeah. And, this isn't just an ADHD difficulty in terms of pornography and healthy relationships. It's everyone.
Yeah, no, yeah, you're right. It's early education.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. But
It's interesting. You say early education. I tell this whenever I teach, but the first time addiction was mentioned to me in any context to do with neurodivergent conditions was when our sons were still in infant school, so junior school maybe. I think they were about 5 and 7, and they were both diagnosed with autism at that point. We met an educational psychologist and the Senko. I can't remember. I just remember the conversation suddenly going very grave, very serious, and the ed psych saying, as parents and as teachers, you've got to learn to distinguish between what are autistic patterns of behavior and just regular childhood patterns of behavior, and what patterns of behavior that can become addiction will look like, because, and it was a real sort of statement, because your sons are more at risk of developing unhelpful addictions to things at a younger age because of their autism. And if you as parents aren't able to spot that, they may well end up as statistics in the criminal justice system. I mean, it was like the biggest, boom, boom, wake up, parents. You haven't just got autistic kids, you've got this to worry about now. I mean, I joke now and go, that should have been a wake-up call for me to go, oh, unhealthy obsessions with things. Maybe I should pay attention, but, straight over my head at that point. But I remember being sort of horrified. And it still sort of horrifies me that is the same now. And yet it probably goes unnoticed. And it's this thing of understanding it isn't just substances. Understanding addictions aren't just substances. I know you guys have got things like NICE guidelines and DSM. So we were chatting, Sarah, about what's defined as what to look at for, or what meets the criteria from a diagnostic point of view. I think the medical model's really useful. The way I define it, part of the biggest problem we have is what I class as the social model or the social conversation of how do we think about what an addiction is and what's acceptable, right? Now, you and I were having this conversation just before we started about, and it's perverse when you think about it, what's an acceptable addiction and what's not, right? So
people's stigma and viewpoints.
Yeah. So you used a brilliant example, and I'm going to get it wrong. You said the difference between somebody who's got a problem with alcohol, or says they've got a problem with alcohol, and somebody who uses the same word with something like heroin. You'd be looked at completely different, wouldn't you?
Yeah. And that, and I hate this word, but that dirty smackhead compared to, well, he just has a little bit of drink too much now and again. And again, we then pull that back to, so yeah, he has 15, 16 cups of coffee a day, and or they have 17, 18 cigarettes in half a morning to get the hand. It's that social construct of what's acceptable and what's not. Having a little bit of Coke on the weekend or having some that's okay. But if you use it too much, then that's wrong. So what's too much? Who gets to decide that it's too much?
Right.
And it's that harmful part.
It is.
It's the harmful part for that person when it's hurting you, and whether that's not physically, whether that's emotionally, whether that is about the relationships around you. When it's hurting you, it's a problem. And you may get a handle on it. You may be able to do it yourself, which is cool. You've got the physical side of things, which, throughout my career, every single time when I have worked with anybody who is drinking harmful amounts of alcohol, you do not stop it. Do not stop it dead right now. Do not stop.
No.
Just don't stop it. It's about healthy reduction. It's about working with people around you because of the physical complications of stopping alcohol suddenly. Again, it's really tricky when you have stopped drinking. Christmas now, everything's about the booze.
Yeah, it is.
We'll go out and have a drink. You go to a barbecue in the summer. Oh, go on, have one bottle. It won't hurt you. You'll be all right with one bottle. You've got a handle on this now. It's really hard.
It is.
Really, really hard. And again, that's society. Alcohol is acceptable.
To
most people.
It is.
I wonder you do have to wonder how people would feel about alcohol if it was being sold by somebody on a street corner.
Well, look, not so many years ago, it was prohibited, and it was under the table, and it was under the counter, and And it did become more of a problem, right? You go back to the
Mhm.
information in prohibition, it was more problematic, and there was more
Yeah.
problematic drinking as well, but that's the difference between, it's like the alcopop syndrome, right? Where we talk about alcohol. When alcopops in the 90s came out, WKD and every Hooch, and I remember all these things, we are
Yeah.
literally marketing 5% plus alcohol, and it's deliberate at young teenagers, not 17-year-olds, not 18-year-olds, at
Yeah.
kids. Right now, that in itself is just wrong, but it happens to legitimize it. Oh, well, it's only a fruity drink. Yeah, but if it's a
Mhm.
fruity drink that leads you to problems, that doesn't matter whether it's fruity or tastes like, engine oil, it's still a problem, right? But this
Yeah.
this conversation, and you've just touched on something, and I hadn't thought of this until you mentioned it, right? If somebody's saying, I'm going to put myself into recovery for problems with alcohol, don't think that cold turkey is the answer straight away. Right now,
Yeah.
I'm going to layer onto this. You mentioned that if we've got ADHD, we're more at risk of relapse anyway, right?
Mhm.
Fine. I think that there is a, what's the word I'm looking for here? Not reductionist, like an absolutist theory with ADHDers. I've heard people say, well, I feel like I'm all or nothing because of my ADHD. And if I'm in, I'm all in. Well, yeah, but if you suddenly are all into your recovery from whatever it is, and you think that the answer is abstinence, unless you are mentally supported and emotionally supported and really well prepared to deal with what that's going to feel like, right? And what withdrawal will feel like, it's probably going to get an awful lot worse. I don't
Yeah.
see that ending well. And again, it's the understanding that we can have the same kind of symptoms of withdrawal from non-substance addictions as well, right? How many parents
It's the
listening?
psychological side.
Right. How many times have you seen
Yeah.
parents tell a kid to turn off the screen and seen the tantrum? Right. I use this as an analogy a lot. People say, how do I spot screen addiction in my kids? I say pay attention to their reactions when you tell them it's time to come off. Pay attention to their reactions when you say, look, we're going to a family event and you can't take your screen. Because if their reactions feel over the top and they feel extreme, I'd be paying a bit more attention at that point to hold on. What does this actually mean to my child? What are they getting from that? Because that doesn't feel like I want to finish that game. That to me would feel like something else. And it's, what's the phrase, Andrew, you mentioned that we see on the adverts for gambling all the time? Not just stop.
When the fun stops,
Oh,
stop.
that's so nice. When the fun stops. It makes it sound so easy. Right, yeah, because if I've got a gambling addiction, I'm going to find that dead easy. By the way, you've just given me a £10 buying bonus and whatever they advertise to make it even
Mm.
easier for me to go and do it. I mean, it's insanity in itself, isn't it? But it appeals to that impulsive, poor decision making side, I think, of ADHD brains that goes, just one more, just another game, just another video, just another whatever it may be. And if we can't stop that just another, whatever it is, that's when I think we've got to start going, okay, what does stopping look like? What do I need? What support do I need? And it's like everything. Putting your hand up and saying I have a problem is probably the hardest thing you'll ever do, which is why so many people don't. Because we're shamed into
Yeah.
saying
So,
you've got a problem.
what I'm picking up here is this is one of those multi-strand things, and we are in our conversation shifting like a needle jumping on a record. For those of us that can, well, vinyl's cool again
It
now,
is, yeah.
isn't it? So people will know what I'm talking about. But there's a few issues here because we started talking about substances and dopamine and that very sort of biological approach to understanding this. And the more I'm listening to you two talk, the more I'm hearing that's not addiction. it's not about the biology, it's not about the substance, it's about the context of that and the meaning of that. And yes, some of those less acceptable dependencies are less acceptable because they're about social taboos. So you guys have been talking about alcohol being socially acceptable, but you know, if you go to the speakeasies in America when prohibition was kicking off, it was a very different type of situation. So often the addiction is grounded in something that is socially not acceptable. Am I right?
Wow.
So then we're tying our own, in addiction, we're tying our own distress and our own discomfort with something that is socially uncomfortable for everybody else.
Yeah, I think there is definitely, that's the phrase I want to use, and this isn't scientific at all. This is just something I've come to the mind of. That's what I class as like a classic definition of addiction, when we are doing those socially unacceptable behaviors or indulging in those socially unacceptable behaviors that that we know are wrong, that we know cause harm, but that we are incapable of stopping, right? However, I think what I've seen more recently as well is people indulging or overindulging in things that to most people would seem perfectly innocuous, like workaholics or exercising too much, or, you know, people that can't say no when they're asked to help at the expense of. Now, all of those things, I think, are probably doing similar things in the brain at some point. They probably get a release of the same kind of dopamine rush because I'm doing good or I'm working well or whatever. And it's the problem comes when the person that's doing it doesn't realize it's a problem yet. You know, that model of the person that always says yes, they're always there to help someone else, because we've got all sorts of things tied in from an ADHD point of view: fear of rejection and emotional dysregulation and a desire to be liked and all of that sort of involved. And yet you've got your family or your wife or your partner going, you are never here for us. Why are you never here for? You're always doing things for other people, but it's good to. No, actually, if you're getting told this is a problem, it's time to look at this and go, why can't I stop doing this? Doesn't matter how many people say you're doing good. Why can't I stop doing this? And why am I not hearing the other side of that conversation? And that's when it comes back to, what have you been told? What is it rooted in? It's a phrase I think we've used before, is, for me, the point where it's obvious to you, to the person, that you have an addiction is the manifestation of an awful lot of something else that's gone on before for who knows how long. And that's why I think the one thing I want to be really clear on that I've learned is, as an ADHDer, recovery from addiction for me and for everyone I've met and worked with ADHD has to include some kind of therapy or counseling to figure out why, as well as some kind of a system, a program, a structure to stay recovered, to stay whatever clean means to you or sober means to you. Because if you don't have both, if you don't address the why, you won't see it coming again as easily. You know, sorry, this is a really ageist reference to anyone under the age of about 30. All I'm going to say is, before I tell you what I'm going to say, press pause, open YouTube, and type in the Pink Panther and Kato. It's politically incorrect, right? But just look at the character of Kato, then come back and you'll understand this reference. Right. Now I've done that, right? I can see you two laughing because you know. The best description of an addictive mind that I ever got was, it's like Kato. Because when you're least expecting it, it leaps out from behind a cupboard or under the bed and makes you do the thing you don't want to do again. And before you know it, you're fighting with yourself. That is the madness of being an addict, is not knowing that you're doing it and everyone else can see you are. Right? And it's it's understanding how your ADHD or other is interplaying with that and why, and being able to listen to people who are saying, this doesn't feel good. This doesn't feel in control, whether it's working too many hours or snorting or injecting or drinking or viewing or whatever it is. If somebody or more than one people are saying, this doesn't feel right, the person has to get to the point where they go, okay, yeah, I probably admit that. But I also think, and I'll ask you to this as nurses experienced for many years, I think that admitting it is harder when we're ADHD as well, and when we're autistic as well, because, and I don't want to use the word masking, this theory of, you touched on it, Andrew, you know, that you were talking about the secondary school model of you're trying to fit in and you know you don't, so you find things that help you feel like you fit in. If we've had so long trying not to admit that we don't feel like we fit in, I think therefore it makes it that much harder for us to admit that not just that we ADHD or autistic, but actually there's an addiction problem there as well. Because that's another layer of, oh, you're really different, you. You're not just different because you've got ADHD, you're ADHD plus. And I wonder if that, I don't know, from your experience, feels right, that it's that fear of, you know, this is actually who I am, whether I like it or not, that we don't want to lay bare.
So it's coming through loud and clear. It isn't what you are addicted to. It's why you're addicted to it. That seems to be just shouting from the rafters in this conversation, and that's making me think differently about this. You know, this idea that there is something that I'm doing that's harmful, but actually it's because there's something over here that I'm not paying attention to, and this is helping me not pay attention to that.
Yeah. It's almost, I don't know, sorry, do you get that? The way I would describe it, it's like in the past, I've lent into that impulsivity. I knew I was impulsive. I knew I had that sort of inattentive capacity, but I kind of just let that take over because it felt more comfortable. Because it was easier than being in the real world.
Yes, but that impulsivity will also have led to good places in the past, not just negativity.
Oh yeah, no,
So
I agree with that.
yeah. And is that one of the reasons to lean into it? Because there's also that, even if it's just that 1% of knowledge in your brain, that on this one occasion, I did something like this and it was really good.
Yeah.
So it's that again, isn't it? It's that myriad of all these different things and all these different experiences that make you go, whoom. There's things for me when we're talking, there's things like, okay, so you've developed an addiction to benzodiazepines, to diazepam. But if I don't use that, I can't sleep. And if I can't sleep, then I'm more ADHD. And it's come back to Andrew's thing about why. What is it that starts that process?
Yeah.
I don't know if that's helpful or not, but that's just where my head was going when
you're
you were
right.
talking about the whys.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there is actually something soothing about feeding the addiction, but it buys a bit of space, a bit of time from that distress, that what.
Yeah.
And that, but it's functional, and actually fearing addiction is potentially an unhealthy way of seeing it, because it's part of how you cope. And if you just say stop it, like the child who's on the screen, you've got to turn that off now. I can't. What am I going to do instead?
Yeah.
And that. So it's because all of these issues are tied up in all sorts of social preconceptions about what substances are, or unhealthy behaviors, or, you know, workaholism. And it's an absolute nightmare. There's so many layers to what's going on, that it's difficult to get to the why, because there's so much what.
Yeah, there is.
We were talking earlier about David Nutt. Now, substance misuse has lost that man jobs.
Wow.
Okay, yeah, he's a professor of I'm not sure if it's neurobiology but it's sort of in this field. But he used to be the government's drugs czar. Okay, and he was sacked by the government because of his approach to substance use. Okay, now we're going back. Maybe it was even the 90s. But he was sacked because it didn't fit with the political agenda of substances are bad. Okay,
Right.
yeah. So he lost his job. He lost his job because he was saying these substances potentially have use in medicine. But are we also actually just doing the same as the Americans did with the speakeasies? And are we driving people to substance misuse because of prohibition? And he lost his job because he was saying that. And it's taken the rest of his career to date to get to the point where he's doing research into the impact of psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, on mood disorders, ecstasy and its impact. Yeah, ecstasy and its impact on post-traumatic stress disorder. Through my career, I've seen social perceptions of substances change, but still there's this taboo that is bound up in this language of dependence and addiction.
What's just jumped up? Yeah.
And depression. That's another one. There's a study going on for ketamine.
What, for use with depression?
People with treatment-resistant depression. There's a study.
It's a licensed product. S-ketamine is a licensed product. You can get a nasal spray.
See, the one that came to my mind then was, and this was brought up as a question, was about medical cannabis. Right? Now, we've spoken about cannabis as being a potentially, a substance we can become addicted to, right? Fine, misuse. But there it is. You can now get it on prescription, I believe, for certain conditions.
Yep.
Medical cannabis. And my understanding is that it comes in different strengths and this is for use for this purpose. Now, that's fascinating because you talk about E-ketamine as well and things. Is this, therefore, like you say about David Nutt, does it take conversation from people who understand that there is different neurobiology, that there is different neurology, that there are different responses to, for example, ADHD level, that there, if you give somebody with ADHD a stimulant and somebody without ADHD a stimulant, they will react differently. Hold on a minute. Just because in the past something has been seen as potentially taboo, is that not the point of good research and the point of good understanding of, well, could it help an group of people? And might that be a route to recovery for some people as well? To say, well, I can now not be dependent on this, but have a safe use of. I think that's such a fascinating thing to have brought up because it's so important. We demonize things. All right, no, actually, no. Scrap the we, that's wrong. Society demonizes things based on historic information, not current information.
It does.
That feels like a fair statement to me. We always base off what's gone before, not what, you two are looking at studies happening now. And we're waiting for the long-term results. But hold on a minute. If you demonize everything, what do people do when something's demonized if they've got a predilection to impulsive behavior? I'll go seek out what I'm not supposed to seek out. Whether it's driving too fast or throwing yourself off a building and saying, I'm an adrenaline junkie, quote unquote, or taking something. It's all for a purpose. It's all to do something, isn't it? And I think that's the conversation is what is it you're trying to do and why? Are you trying to get away from something? Are you trying to mute something? Are you trying to forget something? Or are you struggling with life because it feels so mundane that you feel like you need extra? And what can be done about that? And is there an alternative to that behavior, substance, etc., that you've chosen as a route to achieve that? But for me, if being an addict was less demonized, I think more people would be willing to say, actually, do you know what? I do feel I struggle. I do feel like I've probably overused or overindulged, or that this has been a problem. But because of the societal pressures, I've never felt able to say it. And I think if it was not like that so much, like you say about that, image of a heroin addict we mentioned earlier, I think if it was more compassionate in the way we view things, more people could probably get the help they need. ADHD or not.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, ADHD carries its own. Most days I take amphetamines.
Yeah, right.
It's an illegal drug. You can buy it on the street
Yeah.
corner. But guess what? When I woke up this morning, the first thought through my mind was, I've got to get my
right.
Elvance out. If we were if I was dependent on my ADHD treatment, and I do use it, but I can do without it. If I was dependent on it, there wouldn't be days where I'd be thinking, now, did I take them this morning or did I not?
No.
Because if I didn't, I'd be going, where the hell are they? I want them. I need them. I can't manage without them. So when you were talking there was something that sort of dropped, and it was a thought I had, because I knew we would be talking about addiction at some point. And I was out walking the dog along the river the other night, and there was something that really resonated with what you were just saying about the getting away from. And I'm wondering whether this misuse behavior, whether it's a substance or it's doing something, is it about doing that thing that is seen as bad, and I have a dependence upon it? Is it about, if that is, I'm doing that to take something negative away, and I can't stop, that's a problem. But if I'm doing the same thing and it's bringing something positive into my life, that's not a problem.
No, I agree. But I think the piece that goes with that, then, this rolls back into the relationships conversation from last week, and it rolls back into all the other conversations we've had so far. That's about how we communicate that, and how willing we are to allow people into our lives to say to us, hey, listen, are you okay? To notice when something is being done in a healthy way, or what appears to someone else to be an unhealthy way, and that conversation to be okay to have, rather than, again, at the moment, the stigma attached to saying I am, or I'm not coping. It's, I don't know. I definitely think you're right on that. But there is always the why to be looked at. There is always the why to be looked at. And from an ADHD point of view, I'll go back to that. If I didn't understand the why, if I had not done my work on the past, I couldn't do any work towards my future. That's just goes without saying, and I think that helps me mitigate, going back to this thing about risk of relapse, that helps me mitigate the relapse. Because I can think about why. I can go, am I in the same situation? Are things the same? Have I got the same concerns, struggles, problems now? And if I can do it rationally and go, no, then I can tell myself, well, actually, I'm safe. I feel okay. So therefore, I don't have a need. But it's having people around me that enable that. And not everyone's got that. And I go back to what you said at the start. Sorry, this is where, when someone's homeless, for example, because they've fallen prey, not when they pick up an addiction after homelessness, before, is, I see this in Birmingham when I did work with homeless charities, people that fell became homeless because they'd fallen into addiction. Now, if those people had been picked up as potentially having ADHD earlier and got the support for ADHD and maybe even the medication for ADHD, may they have had a chance to have avoided that story, because they wouldn't have been so susceptible, which does lead to this question. And I'm going to ask this, and I know I'm sure I've asked it before, but I hear it all the time. So I just want to give it to one of you. If my child is on ADHD meds, are they at risk of becoming an addict? See, I know what the answer is, but I just wanted to ask it and smile at you while you both shut your heads, right? But you've been asked that, right? Because I know I have.
And kids themselves. It was, not long ago, I gave a young person option. Me and Andrew were talking about it and the question that the young person, who was awesome, by the way,
Yeah,
sent a message saying, "Can I get addicted to this?"
yeah,
And what a fantastic question!
yeah,
What an
yeah,
awesome question to ask me as a clinician
yeah,
and as a young person to ask that.
yeah.
No, you may like
But
the
yes,
yeah, but yes as well. But the actual tablet you're taking
Yeah, no.
is physically not going to be addictive,
Mm,
as in physically, there isn't withdrawal. It washes out of your system.
yeah,
But there are complications in how it helps you, the feelings it gives you when you are doing well.
yeah. Now there.
Again, it's if you don't treat
Mm,
the outcomes, we know the researched outcomes for people who are not only undiagnosed but also untreated, whatever that treatment means, and the predictive factors.
right.
We know that young people are more likely to have experienced teenage pregnancies. They are more likely to come in contact with criminal justice agencies,
Mm,
addiction services. So it's that juggle, and again,
mm.
it's the coexisting difficulties as well.
And you know what? See, if I take anything away from this conversation, it's that phrase over and over again. Because here we are discussing addiction in isolation. But like you said at the beginning, Sarah, never, ever is it just addiction. Ever. And we've got to look at the coexisting with ADHD, and we've got to look at any trauma, we've got to look at the history, we've got to look at everything as well as. And if that means you have to therefore talk to different people who work for different agencies and different specialists, then that's important, I think, to say is this isn't a standalone topic. You can't just say my addiction's because of this. It's got nothing to do with that, because that's just never going to be right. But it might mean that it takes longer to find, and I don't want to use the word the answer, but to find the understanding of why, and therefore how to manage or beat your addiction as well, or to recover from your addiction, because you do have to understand how everything else is connected. And I think it's
And part
really
of that,
important.
just when you were talking about part of that relapse planning and prevention,
Yeah,
when you work with your care coordinator, you have a diagnosis of ADHD or autism, and you are working with your care coordinator and addiction services, and you're looking at relapse indicators. There has to be planning in those relapse indicators that reflect the challenges that somebody with ADHD
yeah,
and autism may have.
yeah,
That has to be part and parcel of what you're doing. So it isn't just the whys, it's then it moves into so how can we support those whys
yeah,
and those whats?
yeah, yeah,
What do we need to know? Is addiction services staff, how do we help this person who is, the research in the consensus statement tells you you are, you're at a higher chance of relapsing, you are at a higher chance of the recovery not being sustainable. What's making it not sustainable?
yeah,
What's triggering?
yeah,
And like I say, within recovery, there will be relapses, there will be triggers, whether it's 1 or 2 or 3 or 4.
mm,
How they then help you, whilst you have ADHD, whilst you have autism, and you have a neurodivergent brain,
mm,
how that then kicks into all the guilt,
Yeah.
And that you're not a bad person because you had a relapse on this day.
No.
It doesn't make you horrible. It doesn't make
No.
in that black and white thinking, and it's
No.
yeah.
Yeah. But you're right again, therein is that change. If we change the conversation about those kind of things like relapsing or even just struggling to stay recovered, right? You have to start with, for me, the praise of, but you're trying. You are there is a phrase within any 12-step program, right, which I think sums this up perfectly. It's about progress, not perfection. You don't walk into rehab, whatever rehab means, and go, right, done that. Oh, I've just struggled all my life with addiction, and now I've decided I'm not going to anymore. Thanks very much. Off you go, and never. Please, if it was that easy, right? If it were that easy, no, you don't. You struggle with the concept of why, and like you say, understanding how to avoid the why. And you have to be honest, and other people have to be honest with you to say it's okay for this to be a struggle. All right. If I'm told that, at least it's not an excuse. It's not a get out of jail card to say, oh well, I may as well just relapse then. It's not that. It's saying it being hard is all right, but understanding why that happened, what was the trigger, like you said, that's where the help comes in for me.
And it will be tricky for practitioners as well, because you will also have somebody sat in front of you who is, you know, they are awesome at masking.
Yeah.
They are awesome at hiding.
Yeah.
Not just addictions,
Yeah.
difficulties, but their
Yeah.
developmental differences.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. Exactly.
And that makes it really tricky.
Yeah, it does.
Really tricky.
It does.
Yeah.
And I think that's the conversation where I know there's a push at the moment for when, you know, the first time a young person's picked up by the police, that, you know, is that the opportunity, or should that be the trigger for an autism and an ADHD sort of assessment of some kind to go, look, hold on, are we missing anything? Right. And whilst I think, yeah, that's really good, for me, it's the point of, if that person does not know that they are neurodivergent, it's twice as hard. If they do know and they don't want to tell you, it's twice as hard. So you're right, the people they're trying to help have got a really difficult job at that point. If they're not specialist trained, if they don't know what to look for, the signs, the language, the behaviors, what do you, I don't want to word treat, but what do you look to help first, right? But if you have all the information, you can go, well, maybe that behavior is triggered by that, and maybe that response is because of that. Right. As this is a discussion that could run and run, I'm trying to think of a sort of a succinct way, is that the word, to wrap this up. So let me ask you both a question, and I hope this isn't one of those questions, Andrew, he says.
It will be.
I'll try not to. As nurses, clinicians, if somebody comes to you for assessment and they are honest with you and they say, you know, I struggle with X, what does that mean to you in terms of looking at the way you might treat them? Is it a case of, okay, perhaps we need to deal with addiction before we can look at treatment, if we're talking medication?
Quite often, yes, right, but not necessarily yes.
Right.
So if someone comes undiagnosed and says, I'm having this struggle, I think it might be ADHD, it's usually possible to sort of navigate and build a picture of whether or not that's ADHD.
Right.
Yeah, we can do that. But often that addiction is then a barrier to that first step that NICE guidelines tell us to do, give a medication. Right. Because if someone is abusing a dopaminergic substance, which many illicit drugs are, then adding another one in is just adding to the problem. We're not going to actually address the situation. We see this in, probably Sarah can speak more of this, but methadone treatment and people topping up with heroin on top of that.
Right.
You know, we've got to be careful with that line between medicine and substance misuse. And where is it more stark in modern society, I think, than the prescription of dexamphetamine for ADHD? And the confusion that anybody who's not inducted into our world, and many of us that are inducted into the world, that sets about in your head. Why are we giving stimulants to hyperactive people? This is a controlled drug that society says needs to be controlled because it's so dangerous when it's out there on the street. Yet we'll give it to a 6-year-old who can't concentrate on his maths lesson. So there are all these tensions all the time, and this is where that whole what, why, and how story that's evolved through this conversation really comes about. It isn't about what. It isn't about whether it's clonazepam prescribed by your GP or whether it's heroin that you're buying at the local kebab shop. I don't know what it's not about that. It's about why are you looking for the impact of that in your life?
I agree.
It's causing problems. How do we help you to not have that cause problems?
Yeah, makes perfect sense to me.
Otherwise, I'm an amphetamine addict.
Yeah, and as you say, you're not getting up in the morning craving them, or get withdrawal from them. So that sort of makes sense. Sarah, is there anything you would like to add by way of sort of final words for this, at least, episode on this? Because it's another one I know that's going to come back.
Yeah. So when I was working within addiction services, getting referrals to NHS services when somebody has an addiction, so for mental health assessments, for ADHD assessments, is really tricky. So there is no hard and fast guidelines on how long you should be abstinent before you can have an assessment for ADHD. So the research will say around a month of abstinence, but the consensus statement recognises that this isn't always achievable. So what you need to be looking at, when you're doing your assessment on when you're speaking with the person, then being substance free at that point, so not under the influence. Doing the assessment, looking at obviously the long term, so looking at childhood, which I'm going to come to in a minute, but also looking at times in their life when they have been abstinent, which is really useful in terms of looking for the symptoms of ADHD or whether there's other things. You have to have somebody, and it's in the consensus statement, you have to have somebody who is skilled in assessment of mental health difficulties to look for all the other coexisting conditions that could be presenting, like ADHD, and isn't. And then coming back to childhood, when you do an ADHD assessment, it isn't, a definite no, but you're looking for corroborative history. So you're looking for somebody to say what that person's ADHD symptoms are like currently and what they were like in their childhood.
Yeah.
Well, if you're at the chaotic end of substance use, how many of them are speaking to their friends and family? How many have been disowned? How many don't want their family to know? If you're walking into a clinic, and it can be really tricky, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't have the process started and that built in. We can acknowledge that somebody's inattentive, we can acknowledge that somebody's hyperactive, and we can acknowledge that they are impulsive or have social communication deficits. Whether they have a diagnosis or not, that can still be built in to the challenges they have in their relapse prevention. It's changing. Things are getting better, but it is, we talk about people who have addictions and people who are homeless at being at risk of exclusion from services, and that is a big word, exclusion.
Yeah.
So most of the people I worked with that were homeless didn't have access to GPs. They didn't have access to dentists. And that's some of what we were doing. We weren't sort of doing groundbreaking stuff. We were going, seeing people wherever they were. We were getting them registered with a dentist, getting them checked out with women's health clinics.
Yeah.
Looking at anything we could, as well as addictions. And we were going to them because part of the difficulty is that first step over the door.
Of course it is.
So we changed the outreach, and we would go to the person. And at the time, I was working with a fantastic non-medical prescriber who was my supervisor in the team, and we would literally go to somebody and start them on methadone in the hostels.
Wow.
Do it there and then. Let's get the prescription round. It's a pilot, and there's still pilots going on, but it's that reflection that it isn't easy to get an ADHD diagnosis when you are using substances, or the other way. If you have an ADHD diagnosis, getting treatment, like Andrew said, it's really tricky because of all those difficulties, in terms of alcohol putting your blood pressure up and putting your heart rate up, and then we're going to give this medication, and it's the conversations we have about the risks of using caffeine, the risks of using alcohol alongside your medications, and that's going to reduce your access to the services you can get. So there will be lots of online services, right to choose.
Yeah.
There will be lots of online services that just go, this is too much of a risk for us to take. You need to go through the NHS. Well, it's nearly 8 years where we live now.
Yeah.
5 years in the next trust down.
Yeah.
That's 8 years of, and then how long did they want you to be abstinent in your area? One of the things that the consensus statement says is there needs to be so much more research, and not just for ADHD assessment, but for ADHD and substance misuse, in terms of making sure that everybody's working to the same guidelines.
Yeah.
So people know where they stand.
Yeah.
I'll wait it on.
No. It's it's fascinating because I'm just thinking there's that word abstinence again, though, isn't it?
That's what services will say. We want you to be abstinent before we will accept this referral.
Yeah.
Rather than looking at what they're using, how are they using, how often they are using, that sort of thing. It's really tricky.
Yeah.
Really, really tricky.
It is. It really is. I think that's a really valid point, both of those. So the last point I would like to make on this, I suppose, is to speak to, it kind of picks up on partners, to speak to partners of people, ADHDs, autistic people who you have concerns about, have addictions, whatever they may be. And it's something I've heard a lot now in the recovery process. Hard as it is, whatever the pain that's being caused, whatever the issues that have been caused, one of the things I'm hearing a lot is when the ADHD is being blamed for the addiction, or, well, you're just using your ADHD as an excuse. So I think what's important for me to say is it's neither of those things. It will never be that it's the excuse and it's not the cause. It has made it harder. It has potentially, as we've discussed, made it more likely that somebody unfortunately fell prey to addictions, but it is not something to be, if you like, weaponized in conversations. I think the appreciation, if somebody is saying to you that they've acknowledged an addiction, they've acknowledged a problem, is understanding what it means, what is the connection, the interplay between ADHD and whatever their addiction is, getting them the right support, and recognizing that, again, all of the sort of anecdotally, all of the evidence I've now seen is that if people have ADHD, they typically need to, and I'll go back to this phrase we've used a lot, understand the why before they can really have any success with the staying recovered. They have to know and accept and acknowledge and make peace with everything that's caused it, whether that's the feeling like a loner, or like you didn't fit in, or the trauma, or whatever it may be. Maybe it's part of an ADHD mind being inherently inquisitive and wanting answers to questions. I don't know, or an autistic mind. But we need to address the why. We need to spend some time on that whilst we start the journey of recovery, whatever that means to you. Because without it, I think like that research says, we're at risk of relapse, and we're at risk of worse than relapse because we don't have the actual answers. We just know that we've got a problem that's this. So it's working on both strands. And finally, to echo what you said, Sarah, nobody looks like an addict. Nobody behaves like an addict, right? And therefore, we can't judge addiction based on perceptions of what we think it should look like, sound like, behave like. Because if there's anything most addicts are really good at, it's keeping secrets and hiding in plain sight. Sadly, right? And I see you nodding, but that's true. So we have to not judge what we think addiction is or what we think it looks like. We just have to listen to people and hear them and go, okay, what support is it that you are looking for? How do we help? And if more people recognize that, therefore, they can maybe seek help because of that, I think that's one of the most positive things that could come out of the next few years. Because, that I think is doing more harm than anything. You know, we don't all look like our perceptions of alcoholics, drug addicts, or anything else. So just look at people as people. However, that has been pretty heavy, I will say, but I think really important. And I'm so glad to have been able to share that with you two. Your knowledge and insight and your ability to sort of cut through my multi-layered questions and see differences in topics is I think what makes this podcast so important to be doing with you and with the Divergence Clinic, because it's a real human approach to this, right? So I'm really grateful for that, and I'm really grateful for you taking that time to do it with me. And I will just say this to everyone watching: if you have comments, if you have questions, please use them. Please put them on YouTube. You can find the email address for the podcast on all the show notes as well. But please do like this episode if you found it useful. Share it with people that may find it useful, and subscribe however you can do that, because the more you do that, the more people see this, the more people we help. And remember, it's free. It will always be free. We three are not doing this for profit. We're doing this to get better information into this space and into this domain that genuinely we hope helps people. So the more you help us, the more we can help other people in this way. So thank you both very, very much. I will say this: have a splendid Christmas. We're not recording over Christmas, I'll tell you that for nothing. So have a splendid Christmas. Enjoy your jumpers, enjoy your time off, and folks, we will see you for episode, what will that be, 6 at some point in, my God, 2024. So there we are. That's a scary thought. But folks, thank you very much. And this has been the first of the addiction podcasts of Talk ADHD. See you soon.